Welcome back to Mild History. Tonight, we settle in for a slow journey back to the Viking Age. Before the Viking could even consider eating during the brutal winter months, he had to win the quiet, exhausting war against time and decay. With no refrigeration, no industrial salt production, and no modern canning, every calorie secured had to be immediately fought for and preserved. The ultimate key to surviving the winter was the practice of drying, and the king of the dried winter diet was, without question, stockfish. Stockfish was typically cod or another white fish, caught in massive numbers during the fishing season. The process was brutally simple but profoundly effective. The fish would be gutted, their heads removed, and they would be hung without any salt on large wooden racks in the cold, dry Arctic air. The constant drying wind would suck all the moisture out of the flesh over several weeks. What remained was an incredibly light, impossibly hard piece of fish. Pure, solid protein that could last for years. This wasn't a delicious meal. It was a silent, unappetizing insurance policy. To eat it, the dried fish had to be beaten with a wooden mallet, often for a considerable time, until the fibers loosened enough to be chewed or soaked in water for hours. It was a chore to eat, but it was the lifeline that fed longship crews and entire villages from autumn until spring. Next came the vital role of salting and smoking. In late autumn, before the worst cold, the bulk of the livestock, pigs, sheep, and some cattle, would be slaughtered. This event, known as the houst, was a frenzied period of intense labor. The meat was cut and rubbed with precious salt, packed tightly into wooden barrels, or hung high in the smoky longhouse. The smoke from the central hearth, which was used for heat and cooking, was simultaneously a preservative. As the dense herbal smoke curled up through the rafters, it coated the meat and fish hung there, keeping insects away and slowing decay. This dual-purpose architecture meant that the longhouse was not just a home, but a vast, working smokehouse, constantly perfuming the air with the scent of wood smoke, old meat, and survival. Finally, consider the ingenuity of fermentation. The Vikings didn't just preserve food, they transformed it. Milk, which spoiled quickly, was turned into skyr, a thick, sour yogurt that stored the milk's protein content. They also used sour whey, the liquid left over from cheese making, as a natural preservative, submerging meat in it to keep it from rotting. This process created distinct, sometimes pungent flavors, but it turned perishable goods into reliable, storable calories. These methods, drying, salting, smoking, and souring, were not just culinary techniques. They were acts of foresight, born of a deep understanding of the unforgiving northern climate. They were the very foundation upon which every single winter meal would be built. With the precious preserved proteins secured in the cold storage pits and high in the rafters, the Viking attention turned to the absolute core of daily existence, the grain. In the long, dark, frozen silence of the Scandinavian winter, the true staff of life was not the sword, but the small, coarse kernels of barley and oats. This was the fuel that kept the fire of life burning, however slowly. For the vast majority of people living through the Viking Age, particularly the farmers and the less wealthy, the winter diet was defined by a profound and absolute monotony. If you were looking for the grand feasts and rich diversity of the sagas, you were looking in the wrong place. You were looking instead at the simple, enduring bowl of porridge. Porridge, or graut in Old Norse, was the silent, humble champion of Viking survival. It was endlessly versatile, endlessly filling, and endlessly simple. It was the easiest way to stretch limited resources, to turn a small amount of dried grain, usually barley or oats, sometimes rye, into a warm, heavy, belly-filling meal that would sustain a person through hours of cold labor or hours of simply waiting for the sun to return. The labor required for this daily meal, however, was intense and deeply personal. Unlike a chieftain who might have specialized servants, the average Viking family relied on a quernstone, a hand mill, often turned by the women of the household. Imagine the sound, slow and steady in the dim light of the longhouse, the rhythmic shush, shush, shush of the stone against the grain. This wasn't a quick process. It was a prolonged, repetitive, back-breaking chore that had to be performed day after day, week after week, against the clock of hunger. The flour produced was coarse, heavy, and full of the bran that the miller could not completely separate, lending the porridge a dense, almost gritty texture. This grain was never wasted. Every fleck was a calorie earned, a minute of warmth bought. The porridge itself was generally thin, often cooked primarily with water, sometimes supplemented with whey or buttermilk if dairy stocks allowed. The flavor was dominated by the earthy, nutty taste of the barley, often with very little in the way of seasoning. Salt was a precious commodity, often reserved for preservation, not flavor. For the family, a knob of preserved butter, or perhaps a handful of wild, dried berries, lingonberries or blueberries, might be a moment of luxury. But for most meals, it was the simple, warm brown taste of endurance. This continuous simmering led to the concept of the perpetual stew, or skaus. While not a purely Viking invention, it was a practical reality of longhouse life. This was the cauldron that hung perpetually over the central hearth fire, always bubbling, always steaming. It was rarely emptied entirely. Instead, every day, the oldest liquid and the hardest remaining meat would be eaten, and then the pot would be topped up with more water, fresh grain, scraps of newly acquired meat, bone broth, and whatever roots or preserved vegetables were available. This stew evolved continuously. The flavor deepened, becoming complex with the essence of days and weeks of cooking. It was a calorie recycling system, a way to ensure that the fire's heat was never wasted,
and that even the smallest bit of bone or scrap meat contributed to the collective survival. To be a cook in a Viking longhouse in winter was to be the caretaker of the perpetual stew, the silent guardian of the family's continuous life source.
The contrast between this monotonous, essential porridge and the rare indulgence of bread is also important to consider. Bread, especially leavened bread, required a significant investment of time, fuel, and careful handling. It was a luxury. More common were simple flatbreads, quick patties made from the coarse flour and cooked directly on hot stones by the hearth. These were eaten immediately, a simple vehicle for butter or perhaps a bit of preserved fish, but they did not replace the porridge. The warmth, the ease of digestion, and the sheer caloric volume of the gruel kept it at the top of the winter menu. The psychological impact of this monotonous diet cannot be overstated. Imagine the feeling of waking up in the cold, smoky longhouse, knowing that the day's first meal, the midday meal, and the final meal would be, in essence, the same warm, heavy, grain-based meal. It was a silent testament to the scarcity of the season, a constant, low-level anxiety that told the body that it was surviving but not thriving. The scarcity meant that every grain of barley, every oat flake was treated with religious respect. Spillage was a disaster. Waste was unthinkable. The children would be taught to scrape their bowls meticulously to ensure that the remnants of the porridge, the sticky, flavorful residue at the bottom, were consumed, because those final calories could be the difference between making it through a freezing night and slipping into hypothermia. This reliance on grains was a quiet form of self-discipline. It demanded patience, foresight, and a profound respect for the simple, elemental necessity of food. The Viking did not fight the winter with silver and swords, but with the humble, enduring power of the coarse barley grain, ground slowly by hand, cooked slowly over the fire, and consumed slowly in the dim, enduring light of the longhouse. It was the taste of winter survival, thick, warm, and utterly, profoundly essential.
The protein lifeline, fish and fowl. If the porridge was the foundation of the Viking winter diet, then the bounty of the sea was the framework. The cold, nutrient-rich waters surrounding Scandinavia provided a source of protein that was absolutely indispensable, particularly when the livestock herds had been drastically culled during the autumn slaughter. This reliance on the sea meant that life and survival were permanently tied to the vast, cold ocean and the rivers that snaked through the land, even when frozen solid. We return to the silent, enduring champion of winter protein, stockfish. Imagine the texture, the density, the very hardness of this food. It was not soft or yielding. It was, essentially, a wooden plank of dried cod, a testament to efficient preservation. The stockfish, once hung and dried for weeks in the Arctic air, had to be rendered edible through brute force. This involved a tedious, loud, and necessary ritual, the beating. Hour after hour, chunks of the rock-hard fish would be placed on a stone or block of wood and struck repeatedly with a wooden mallet.
The purpose was to soften and loosen the fibers so that the fish could be torn apart into chewable, edible flakes. The sound of this beating, a dull, rhythmic thudding, was a ubiquitous background noise of the Viking winter, the sound of calories being prepared, the sound of life sustaining itself against the odds. The flavor of this stockfish, even after soaking, was pure, stark essence of the sea, often lacking the rich oiliness of fresh fish, but providing protein in a compact, near indestructible form. It was often eaten alongside the thick, warm porridge, serving as a chewy contrast to the soft grain, ensuring the body received the vital nutrients necessary to maintain muscle mass and ward off scurvy. The other major marine source was herring, a fish caught in enormous shoals and preserved primarily through salting and fermentation. While salt was expensive, the bulk capture of herring made salting economically viable. The fish would be packed tightly into barrels with layers of salt and left to cure. This resulted in a dish that was immensely flavorful, deeply salty, and capable of lasting through the winter months. In the later Viking Age, the fermentation of herring became an important technique, producing a pungent, highly acidic food that, though challenging to the modern palate, was a powerhouse of probiotic health and caloric density for the Norse people. Securing this bounty during the deepest cold required specialized, dangerous labor. The Vikings did not simply wait for spring, they adapted to the frozen environment. They practiced ice fishing, cutting holes into the frozen lakes and fjords. This was perilous work, demanding knowledge of ice thickness and patience in the cold, exposed air. It was often the quiet, necessary work done by older men or boys, providing a trickle of fresh or immediately dried fish to break the monotony of the stored stocks.
The hunt for fowl and game provided occasional, luxurious relief from the preserved stores. While large game like elk and boar were usually secured and salted during the autumn, trapping of smaller winter birds was a constant activity. Imagine the quiet, careful setting of snares and traps in the frozen forests. Every bird caught, a partridge, a grouse, or an ocean bird, meant a small amount of fresh meat and the opportunity to use every single part. The bones could be added to the perpetual stew to enrich the broth. The feathers could be used for insulation or fletching. Nothing was wasted. Every feather, every sinew was calculated as a resource. This reliance on both land and sea meant that the Viking diet was deeply seasonal and geographically influenced. Coastal settlements relied heavily on the endless bounty of cod and herring, while inland communities focused more on preserved meat, mutton, goat, and forest trapping. But for all, the concept remained the same. Survival was a matter of logistics. It was about ensuring that the protein secured in the short months of warmth could be stretched, beaten, soaked, and chewed for the long, dark, unforgiving months of cold. The presence of this protein was the invisible shield against disease and starvation. The stockfish may have been tough, the salted herring intensely strong, but they were the quiet heroes of the Longhouse, the reason the Vikings could wake up day after day and continue their struggle against the brutal, frozen north.
The long, cold darkness of the Nordic winter demanded a specific kind of fuel. The human body needed to burn more intensely, more consistently, just to maintain core temperature against the relentless external chill. This fuel was fat, and the ingenuity of the Viking Age lay in its ability to take a perishable liquid, milk, and transform it into dense, transportable, and long-lasting forms of pure energy. This transformed dairy became the true fortress that protected the Viking from freezing. The most essential of these dairy products was, of course, butter. Imagine the labor of the churn. It was a repetitive physical effort, often done in the cool, rhythmic semi-darkness of the longhouse. The milk, fresh from the cow or goat, was worked until the fatty globules separated, coming together into the soft, yielding mass we know as butter. This was not butter for spreading thinly. This was survival butter. Once churned, the butter was immediately treated for preservation. It was heavily salted. The precious mineral worked deep into the fat. Salt acts as an antibacterial agent, drawing out moisture and creating an environment where decay cannot take hold. This dense, salty mass was then packed layer upon dense layer into tight wooden barrels, sealed carefully to keep out air and moisture. This dense, earthy flavor was the taste of pure stored energy. Alongside butter, the other great transformer of milk was cheese. Cheese was milk solidified, protein and fat locked into a stable matrix that would not spoil. The process was a matter of chemistry and timing, using rennet from a calf's stomach to curdle the milk, separating the solids, the curds, from the liquid, the whey. The resulting curds were pressed, salted again, and left to age. A hard, well-aged cheese was essentially an indestructible block of nutrition, easily transported and capable of lasting through multiple winters. It was the preferred portable food for travelers, raiders, and traders, providing the dense energy needed for long days on the sea or trail.
But the process of cheese-making yielded a critical byproduct: whey. This watery, yellowish liquid, often overlooked today, was gold to the Vikings. Whey contains residual protein, sugars, and vitamins, and it was used in myriad ways. It was a safer, more nutritious substitute for water in cooking, added to porridges and stews. Crucially, whey was often allowed to go slightly sour, creating a powerful, acidic souring agent that was used to pickle and preserve meat, acting as a natural, readily available brine. Nothing was wasted. The initial milk was partitioned into 3 life-saving forms: the durable fat of butter, the solid protein of cheese, and the protective, acidic liquid of the whey. Finally, we consider skyr, a dairy product often described as a form of thick Greek-style yogurt, but technically a very soft cheese. Skyr was made by adding a culture to skimmed milk, allowing it to curdle and then draining off the whey. What remained was a dense, incredibly high-protein food. For a population often suffering from monotonous flavors, skyr offered a sharp, tangy taste,
but its real value was its long shelf life and nutritional density. It was a reliable source of protein that could be eaten plain or mixed with dried berries or honey on the rare occasions such sweetness was available. It was a testament to the fact that even the simple act of preserving food could elevate a perishable liquid into a powerhouse of sustainable energy. The very existence of this dairy fortress speaks to the anxiety of the cold months. During the deepest winter, milk production from livestock would plummet. Cows and goats, often surviving on the bare minimum of stored hay or even fodder like dried leaves, produced far less. The Viking family's winter survival rested entirely on the success of their autumn hoarding. If the harvest was poor, if the slaughter was disappointing, or if the dairy had not been properly preserved, the fortress would crumble, and starvation would inevitably follow. The consumption of these fats and dairy products was not just caloric, it was a profound psychological comfort. Eating a spoonful of rich, preserved butter or chewing a piece of tough, salty cheese was an affirmation that the diligence of the previous season had paid off. It was the taste of foresight, a warm, rich flavor that momentarily banished the icy dread of the endless dark. It confirmed that the family was stocked, secure, and ready to meet the challenges of another cold day.
The emergency rations, the brutal foods. When the barrels of salted butter began to feel too light, when the stack of stockfish was tragically diminished, and when the perpetual stew showed more water than sustenance, the Viking household had to turn to the true, final resources of survival. These were the foods that carried a profound stigma, the emergency rations that signaled a family was sliding from difficulty into genuine peril. They were the brutal, final measures against starvation. The first strategy when scarcity hit was a return to the remains of the slaughter. We touched upon the thoroughness of the housed, the autumn slaughter, but in times of famine, that thoroughness became absolute. Every scrap, every tendon, every organ that might have been deemed slightly less worthy of preservation was now the most valuable commodity. The long, slow boiling of bones became a continuous task. Bones, often cracked open to expose the marrow, were thrown into the scaudus, the perpetual stew, and left to simmer for days on end. This created a dense, greasy bone broth, a liquid rich in fat and collagen. This broth was not just warm, it was a potent source of energy that could sustain a struggling body when solid food was scarce. The marrow itself, scooped out and consumed, offered a final, rich, concentrated boost of fat. This process was messy, tireless, and utterly essential, a grim confirmation that the family was eating its future, consuming the very structure of the animals that were supposed to breed new life in the spring. Beyond the bones, the very blood of the animals, initially reserved for high-status blood puddings or stews, became a survival staple for the desperate. Blood contains rich protein and iron, and when mixed with scarce grains and fats, it could be cooked into dense, sustaining patties or loaves. This was not a pleasant food, often carrying a metallic, heavy taste, but its nutritional profile was unmatched in a scarcity scenario. Eating blood was a direct confrontation with the reality of famine.
The most extreme recourse, known in historical accounts from later medieval periods, but rooted in ancient necessity, was the incorporation of bark bread. This was the food of absolute, utter desperation, reserved for the very poorest or those facing total crop failure. When the last bag of barley was empty, the family turned to the forest. They would gather the soft inner bark, the cambium layer of specific trees, often pine. This inner bark was carefully scraped away from the hard exterior, dried by the hearth fire, and then ground into a fine powder. This bark flour possessed a small amount of starch, but its primary purpose was filler. It was mixed with the meager amount of real grain flour left, or sometimes with dried moss or lichen, to create a thin, brittle bread.
The resulting meal was bitter, rough on the digestive system, and provided few actual calories, but it had the profound psychological and physical benefit of simply filling the stomach. It offered the false promise of fullness, easing the intense, constant pangs of hunger that define true starvation. Consuming bark bread was a deeply shameful sign, confirming to the community that a family was on the absolute brink of total collapse. Finally, the desperate Viking turned to wild foraging, even in the cold. While the main harvest was over, certain hardy wild plants like nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic could sometimes be found, or their preserved roots dug up from under the snow. These small, bitter plants offered a trickle of vital vitamins like vitamin C, helping to ward off the debilitating effects of scurvy, which was a very real winter threat. This foraging was often done in secret, alone, covering vast distances in the cold, driven by the knowledge that without these few bitter leaves, the family might not see the spring sun. The consumption of these brutal foods, the ground bone, the blood bread, the bitter bark, was the ultimate humbling experience of the Norse winter. It was a period of sensory and spiritual deprivation, where taste was sacrificed entirely for the cold, hard logic of calories. It forced the Viking to confront the terrifying fragility of their survival, and it left an indelible physical memory of hunger that would drive their planning, their raiding, and their work ethic for the rest of the year.
The seasonal cycle, the transition of taste. The Viking year was not simply a passage of months. It was a relentless cyclical battle against scarcity, marked by dramatic shifts in the food supply. To truly understand the winter diet, we must understand the highs and lows of the seasonal wheel, the few moments of indulgent flavor that made the long, monotonous months of consumption bearable. The highest point in this cycle was the autumn slaughter, or houst. This was not merely a chore, it was a communal, frenzied event that marked the transition from growth to survival. It was a time of temporary, profound abundance, where the scent of warm, fresh blood and rendering fat filled the air. Livestock that could not be fed through the winter, primarily pigs, older sheep, and cattle, were culled, and for a glorious, brief window, the family feasted on fresh meat. Imagine the taste of fresh pork or mutton roasted over a crackling fire, the fat sizzling and dripping, seasoned with simple herbs and perhaps a touch of precious imported spice. This was the moment of indulgence, a calorie-rich celebration that filled the body with reserves and provided a crucial psychological buffer against the starvation that to come. Every bite was an affirmation of the past season's success. Every shared piece of meat was a strengthening of familial and communal ties. But the host quickly demanded diligence. While some meat was immediately eaten, the vast majority had to be immediately prepared for preservation, salted, smoked, dried, and packed into the darkness. The blood dishes, like puddings and sausages, were consumed first, as blood spoils instantly. It was a race against time and decay, fueled by the very bounty they sought to save. Once the barrels were sealed and the last pieces of fresh meat were consumed, the long, slow, monotonous descent into the winter diet began. The psychological toll of this change was immense. For months, the Viking palate was restricted to the powerful, uniform tastes of preservation. The sharp saltiness of the cured meat, the intense bitterness of the stockfish, the acidic tang of the fermented whey and skyr, and the bland earthiness of the perpetual porridge. Flavor variation was nearly inexistent. This monotony was not merely boring, it was a constant, subtle reminder of vulnerability. The same taste, day after day, served as a low-frequency hum of anxiety, a sensory confirmation that the family was eating its way through a finite, non-renewable stockpile. It was the absence of flavor innovation that spoke volumes about the threat of the Nordic environment. The rare moments of sweetness or strong flavor came from stored resources. Honey, if they were lucky enough to harvest it, was gold, used sparingly to flavor mead or sweeten the porridge for the sick or young. Dried berries, lingonberries, blueberries, gathered and sun-dried in the summer, were sprinkled over food like jewels, providing a sharp burst of vitamin C and a brief, joyous sensory memory of warmth and sunshine. These were not ingredients, they were precious sensory events. Then came the long-awaited spring. As the days began to lengthen and the harsh cold retreated, the family was often at its most vulnerable. The stores were at their absolute lowest, and the threat of scurvy and malnutrition was at its peak. Every eye was turned toward the ground, searching not for treasure, but for the first signs of green. The discovery of the first edible sprouts, nettles, young sorrel, or wild herbs, was a moment of profound, quiet celebration. These greens, however bitter or tough, were immediately boiled into thin, vital soups. They were the first fresh vitamins the body had seen in 6 months, and the effect was restorative, both physically and spiritually. The taste of fresh green growth was the taste of hope, the first solid confirmation that the long fast was nearing its end and that the cycle of growth was beginning anew. The seasonal cycle of the Viking diet was thus a deep lesson in patience and anticipation. It taught them to feast with discipline, to endure with monotony, and to greet the first small signs of returning life with a gratitude that we can barely imagine today. The food they ate was not just sustenance, it was a calendar, a clock, and a deep, continuous ritual of survival.
Hydration and heat, the drinks. In the relentless cold of the Viking winter, the simple act of hydration became profoundly complicated. Rivers and surface water froze, and even if clear water could be found, it carried the risk of disease.
Therefore, plain, cold water was often replaced by a steady consumption of various drinks, all of which served the triple purpose of providing safe hydration, delivering critical calories, and offering essential warmth. The most fundamental of these liquids, the drink consumed by nearly everyone, regardless of status, was ale. Ale, brewed primarily from barley or sometimes oats, was the daily drink. It was usually low in alcohol content, often consumed as soon as the fermentation process was complete. This was not the strong, heady brew reserved for celebratory feasts. This was the table beer, the safest liquid available. Boiling the water during the brewing process killed bacteria, making the resulting ale far safer than any cold water drawn from a dubious source. Imagine the taste. Slightly murky, yeasty, and thick with the residual grain, often flavored with bitter herbs like bog myrtle or juniper instead of hops, which were not commonly used in Scandinavia until later. This ale was consumed throughout the day, providing not just hydration, but a constant trickle of calories from the residual sugars and grains. For a body struggling to conserve energy in the cold, this small, steady caloric input from ale was vital. A warm, life-sustaining liquid that maintained both hydration and core temperature. Beyond ale, the byproduct of the dairy process provided the next layer of hydration: whey. We discussed whey as a preservative, but it was also a daily drink. Whey, the liquid left over after milk was curdled into cheese or skyr, was thin, slightly sour, and rich in residual proteins, minerals, and B vitamins. It was a crucial, free-of-cost source of hydration that made use of every drop of the precious milk supply. It could be drunk straight, often warm by the hearth, or used as the liquid base for thinning the perpetual stew or boiling the daily porridge. Its tart, slightly acidic flavor was simply another unavoidable taste of winter survival. But when the cold deepened, the emphasis shifted to hot liquids, the simple, elemental heat that could permeate the body and restore circulation. This is where broths and thin soups came into their own. The continuous bubbling of the scouse, the perpetual stew, ensured there was always a warm liquid available. Thin ladles of the broth, enriched by days of slowly dissolving bones, connective tissue, and fat, were drunk like tonic. These broths were a high-fat delivery system, helping the body replenish the lipids burned off in the constant fight against hypothermia. The act of sipping this warm, savory liquid was a profound psychological comfort in the face of the external cold, a moment of internal warmth in the communal longhouse. We must also consider the most famous but least common Viking drink, mead. Mead, the fermented drink made from honey, was the drink of ceremony, ritual, and high status. Honey itself was rare and valuable. Therefore, mead was not a staple of the winter diet. It was reserved for the great religious festivals, the weddings, the burial feasts, and the rare political gatherings that took place in the long winter months. Its consumption was a social event, a moment when the community collectively indulged, forgetting the privations of the daily diet. Drinking mead in the depths of winter was a statement of success and wealth, a momentary suspension of the harsh reality of survival.
The intoxicating warmth of mead was a powerful social bonding agent, helping to ease the tension and cabin fever brought on by months of being confined together.
The entire winter drinking strategy was a meticulous calculation. It avoided the dangers of frozen, possibly contaminated water sources. It minimized the need for expensive fuel by prioritizing liquids that were already hot or could be consumed at room temperature. And most importantly, it provided a constant, steady stream of easy calories, small, continuous energy boosts that allowed the Viking body to sustain its metabolism against the unrelenting cold. The clanking of wooden cups, the hiss of the steam, and the faint, yeasty smell of barley ale were the sounds and scents of winter security in the longhouse, a constant sensory affirmation that the family had, for another day, managed to keep the warmth within and the cold outside.
Food as social status. Feast versus famine. In the intensely structured and hierarchical world of the Vikings, survival during winter was not just a matter of logistics, it was a profound political statement. The food a Viking ate, the quality of the drink they poured, and the ability of their hall to host a meal were the most visible indicators of their wealth, their foresight, and the very security of their family's future. The difference between the chieftain's table and the common farmer's hearth in the depths of winter was truly the difference between abundance and bare subsistence, the stark divide between feast and famine. Consider the chieftain's store. A powerful jarl or chieftain demonstrated his fitness to lead not by the size of his army, but by the depth of his stores. His longhouse was a massive, communal warehouse holding the consolidated wealth of the clan. This meant his provisions were not just plentiful, but varied. He could afford to import valuable salt in large quantities, ensuring his meat was better preserved and tastier. He controlled access to honey, meaning his family and guests could drink mead and sweeten their food, a luxury that broke the monotony endured by everyone else. The ability of a jarl to host a lavish feast in the middle of the darkest, coldest winter was the ultimate act of political theater. Imagine entering the chieftain's hall on the darkest night of the year. Outside, the land is frozen, the air is still, and starvation is a real threat. But inside, the air is thick with the scent of roasting meat. Not the tough, dried mutton, but perhaps a large haunch of pork or even venison, indicating successful hunting or extensive trade. The hearth is roaring, and mugs of strong mead are passed around. By offering this temporary escape from scarcity, the chieftain reinforced his power, binding his followers through obligation and gratitude. These feasts were not mere parties, they were crucial winter mechanisms for reaffirming loyalty and maintaining social order. In sharp contrast stood the family of the poor farmer. Their survival was a fragile, day-to-day calculation. For the common family, the winter diet was a public display of scarcity. They ate the cheapest, toughest survival foods we have described, the bark bread, the thin, whey-based porridge, and the relentlessly beaten stockfish. They had to rely on low-calorie ale instead of mead, and often had to break their stored butter open on rare, desperate occasions. Their food was not shared with neighbors.
It was hoarded, carefully weighed, and consumed in a quiet, anxious silence. The sight of a family reduced to eating bark was a quiet social poison, a visible sign of weakness that neighbors would note, confirming who was strong and who was vulnerable. This disparity created a powerful system of debt and dependency. When a poor family's stores ran low in late winter, they would often have no choice but to appeal to the chieftain for help. Receiving a barrel of grain or a piece of preserved meat was an act of mercy, but it also incurred a permanent obligation. The family receiving the food was effectively selling a part of their future labor or the allegiance of their sons to the jarl. Food in this context was leverage. It was a tool of political control, maintaining the social stratification for another year.
Furthermore, access to food defined gender rules and status. The women of the longhouse were the ultimate guardians of the winter stores. Their skill in preservation, the meticulous salting, the careful drying, the correct fermentation of skyr determined the survival of the entire family. A woman whose stores spoiled or who mismanaged the rations brought shame and real danger upon the household. Their labor, though quiet and constant, was the invisible bedrock of winter security, and their status rose or fell based on their success as managers of the finite, preserved inventory. Even the trading of food reflected status. A rich merchant might import expensive goods like nuts, figs, or even spices from the Byzantine Empire, tiny luxuries that proved his vast network and wealth. These were not for survival, they were for display, a way to break the culinary monotony of winter and signal their distance from the scarcity endured by the common folk. The final, silent testament to this social stratification was the fear of starvation itself. While the chieftain and his inner circle lived with the comfort of ample stores, the common folk lived with the persistent, chilling dread of a cold spring. Their survival was a zero-sum game. Every calorie consumed was a calorie removed from the communal future. The history of the Viking winter diet, therefore, is not merely a list of ingredients. It is a detailed account of power dynamics, political security, and the simple, enduring fact that in the brutal cold of the north, food was not just sustenance, it was the very currency of life, loyalty, and dominance. And as the long night finally ended, the wealth displayed in the stores determined who walked out into the spring sun as a leader, and who emerged as a desperate dependent. And so we conclude our long, quiet journey into the longhouse of the Viking winter. We have contemplated the meticulous labor of preservation, the monotony of the barley porridge, the necessity of the tough stockfish, and the final desperation of the bark bread. We have seen how the daily routine was a constant grueling calculation, a perpetual war against the forces of cold, decay, and hunger. As you now drift away from the smoky interior of the longhouse, remember the quiet resilience required to live in a world where every piece of fat, every salted herring, and every cup of ale was a victory hard won against the odds.
It was a life defined by foresight, diligence, and an absolute respect for the limited resources of the earth. Let the final anxieties of the Viking winter fade from your mind. Feel the warmth and security of your own space. Allow the gentle sounds of this ancient struggle to become soft and distant. Your stores are full. Your fire is warm. Rest now. Sleep well.